Wait, we're not. We're pressing the red
How
button.
do you fuck off?
Just press it.
Just press it. Let's get going.
No, that's all right.
3.
Don't worry about that. What counts is from now on.
All right, let's just get going. Okay. All right. Welcome. Welcome everyone to this episode of Red Star Over Asia, the podcast that covers Asian politics, history, and social movements from a socialist and communist perspective. Today we will be talking with a very special guest about the Indian farmers' strike and the resurgent movement happening in India. It's all very exciting stuff.
I don't get any love for this, but I'm like, I will argue this until the day I die. That the Indian bourgeoisie is the dumbest bourgeoisie in the world.
But first, let's introduce our co-hosts and then our guests. My name is Mike, based in Busan, South Korea, and we have Bori. Bori, how you doing?
Hi, Mike. I'm Bori. I'm based in Seoul. Great to see you guys again.
Absolutely. All right, and then we have Jack, also up in Seoul. How you doing, Jack?
How's it going, comrades? Welcome to the podcast.
All right, and then we have Jay from Gwangju, but currently exiled in the American Empire. How are you doing in that shithole country?
Awake and in the Midwest.
All right, and then we have a very special guest today to talk about the events in India going on with this farmers movement, Ashok Kumar. So Ashok Kumar is an Indian American activist, socialist, and academic. He is a lecturer at Birkbeck University, a recent author of a very interesting book, Monopsony Capitalism, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But first off, Ashok, how are you doing, buddy?
Yeah, I'm good, man. I'm in lockdown London, just waiting it out, you know?
Oof. Yeah, we're luckier in South Korea, I guess, but yeah, tough times in the UK and the US. Over the past year, there has been a massive social movement in India around 3 sets of bills that dramatically reform how agriculture works in India. There's been a massive response on the part of Indian farmers. In November, we saw possibly maybe the largest general strike in history by some counts, 250 million people. So farmers in Punjab and other sort of breadbasket regions of India have come out in mass against a set of legislation put forward by the right-wing Hindu nationalist Modi government that will deregulate the agricultural sector and immiserate farmers even more than they already are. So there's been massive mobilizations in the capital and across the country. So Ashok, you're very familiar with this area. Your book touches on this. So can you sort of give us a general context of what's happening with these? What are these farm bills, and why is there such a aggressive response on the part of these farmers to this legislation?
The protests of the encampment. I mean, obviously the protests predate the when the encampments began, but I'll get into that in a minute. But basically the bills were kind of rushed through in September under the kind of auspices of COVID emergency bills. And yet, like you said, there's 3 bills. And it's a bit bureaucratic to try and explain the various acronyms that are involved with it. But basically what you had is, in the 1960s, you had a series of laws that were passed that protected 23 crops that were produced that were seen as kind of cash crops that had lots of variability and were kind of at the whims of the vicissitudes of the market. And it said that there was a minimum that they would pay for these crops. And these would be done through the way that it would be purchased was through government-owned mandis, these kind of basically wholesalers that are orchestrated and organized by the state. And that's the only place where farmers could sell these products. And then those products were then they would be sold off in kind of auction style to various different kind of distributors. And that was the way that you would kind of protect farmers. And so what the bill does is a kind of clever way of not abolishing these APMCs, these mandis, It's not abolishing these kind of committees that establish the mandis, which are then administered through the state structure. It's imposed by the federal system, but it's administered through state structures. APMCs are these committees, and mandis are the actual kind of wholesale areas where farmers can sell to distributors. The MSP is the minimum prices that you have to give, the minimum support pricing. That's what MSP stands for. Basically, it doesn't abolish any of that. What it says is, okay, all it does is it says, and this is the same kind of neoliberal discourse that you use everywhere, which is like, we're increasing choice. There's nothing wrong with choice. You've got a problem with choice, that means that you're selling a bad product, clearly. So it's like, if what they're saying is that like we're gonna allow these farmers to sell to private buyers. It's not alongside selling in mandis. The problem with that is that you have basically large conglomerates and financiers that play the long game. It's like any kind of finance capital with anything. Like I remember back in the day, one of the models for like Starbucks was, I don't know how true this is, but they'd be like a little like cafe that was popular in some small dinky town, and they would open up a Starbucks on the left side and the right side, and they would run at a deficit. And then basically they would bleed that coffee shop dry. And then once it packed up and left, they would undercut it. And then one Starbucks would stay, the other one would leave. And then they would just like put whatever price they want on coffee. Similar to like Uber, for example, which like loses money on every ride, but basically is trying to price everyone out. And it's based on like large kind of VC capital, right? So it's like, similarly here, what you'd see is that, you have large conglomerates that are trying to basically, increase the terrains of profitability, which is what they're trying to do with agriculture in India. It's really shocking that for an fairly industrialized country, almost 70% of the population still is, dependent directly or even indirectly on agricultural labor, right? So by indirectly, I mean that they're working seasonal farmers, seasonal kind of laborers. And then there's hoarding, which is like allows for hoarding, which, in agriculture, because it's seasonal, if you're allowed to hoard and you're like completely up for a kind of supply, it's based on supply and demand, the people that can hoard longer, especially with non-perishable products, you just sell it during a non-seasonal period when, and all of a sudden you can jack up the prices. It's pretty simple, right? And so hoarding is like always bad, but it's particularly bad for agriculture. And then the last one is getting rid of the ability to contest this through the courts, or at least restricting it. So the main opposition is the first bit, and yeah, that's kind of the breakdown of that. And then you had a protest movement in response to that was driven by farmers in Punjab and Haryana region, the kind of breadbasket regions of India, and then also Western UP, Western Uttar Pradesh. These are like areas that are both highly agriculturally rich around the products that are being included in these 23 MSPs, particularly around rice and wheat, and also that their proximity to Delhi, is quite important as well. Particularly, I'm talking about like Western Uttar Pradesh. And so, you had 300,000 workers set up this encampment, and it's kind of on a rolling basis. And it's really interesting to read about how the ways in which this has been organized, particularly from Punjab region. It's like fully taken on a kind of the ways in which people have been driven to, take turns, and villages are like working together to provide food. And it's pretty amazing, actually. And they've kind of mainly blocked key arteries around Delhi region. The strike it's a bit more complicated, the strike that took place, the 250,000 people, because, you have large unions in India, many of them affiliated to Communist Party, at least two of the big ones, CITU and AITC, affiliated to CPM, Communist Party Marxist, Communist Party India, respectively. But they are, bogged down by decades of bureaucracy and routine. And actually, they do this yearly. This year, they had 7 demands, particularly around these anti-labor laws that were passed. The anti-labor laws that included like restrictions on the ability to strike, restrictions on and allowing employers to fire workers more easily, expanding how many you need what proportion of workers you need in order to get recognition from employers. And so that was the primary driver, I would say, of the trade unions who went on, the unions calling for the strike. But then they also included, one of the 7 demands was around repealing the labor law. So I think it's a bit more complicated than this was, a solidarity strike. I mean, typically these strikes have been organized as a way to divert, it's like symbolic rather than, one-day strikes don't do shit. I mean, let's be honest. Right. I mean, it's just symbolic. I mean, if you want to do something, go on strike indefinitely and then don't tell people when you're going to end it. I mean, that's literally the only part. Usually one-day strikes are kind of almost, they're used as furloughs by employers, right? We know that even everywhere. So, I mean, it's more symbolic than everywhere. I mean, even in London, Britain, 10 years ago, you had all these brain dead bureaucrats being like, general strike. I'm like, just ask for an extra £1 per hour for your employers. We don't need any showboating, talking left, acting right bullshit. So that's what I feel like I've been a little bit more cautiously supportive of. The trade unions do this kind of stuff, which is good, but also, is it building militancy? There's no real evidence of that. But yeah, it's really good what's happening. I mean, we'll get into it, but there's been a historic, obviously, antagonism between the interests of farmers and farmer organizations and unions and traditional trade unions and worker organizations. So.
All right, so you made the point that the government is trying to sell this bill as we'll keep the system, but you just have increased choice. Some of the stuff that I've seen is that so one big thing about this is that it's going to kind of redefine how land ownership works. So in a lot of these communities in Punjab, these farming communities, the idea of land ownership, there's not necessarily you own your land and there's a deed on paper that's filed in an office that shows that you own this land. And that part of this is trying to formalize that so it makes it easier to actually buy these people out. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I actually think that in Punjab, it's probably the most developed conception of land ownership because it's very cash crop heavy. I think there's a lot of regions where it's much more the definition, that kind of what is defined as land ownership, what's not, is a bit more ambiguous. I think that the bigger problem is less around the ambiguity of land ownership and not with this bill. I think the bigger issue is the erosion of not the direct erosion of, but the erosion of it creates huge rent-seeking constituencies of organizations and bodies and financiers that can then erode the agrarian reforms of the 1950s. You had the kind of land at the tiller law that was announced by Gandhi in the 1930s. That one of the first laws that India should pass is a kind of land at the tiller law, because India had a kind of system of feudalism. Jamindar system, where you had huge tracts of land owned by a handful of people, right? Like most of the world, and they broke up much of that. So there were limits on how much land one individual could own or a family could own. It was, typically 30 acres, no more than that. So you had a lot of you did have quite a bit of distribution of land. Certainly not as far as it should have been, or not nearly as far as it should have been. But you did have that. You had a breaking up of the system, the Jamindar system. But with some cash crops, that's not the case, because they said, okay, well, this having 30 acres with certain kinds of crops will undermine our ability to produce sufficient amounts. So what it does is basically, it doesn't do this directly as much, but indirectly, my reading of it at least, is that indirectly the whole point is that you make it so that it becomes increasingly difficult for smaller farmers to subsist, or and what you do is increase the political power of larger farmers. And it's a form of dispossession. I mean, they've basically said as much. Modi did this speech where he says, "Oh, this is going to be great for technological investment." There's nothing in the bill that's about technological investment at all. I mean, this is the way that they've distributed everywhere. I mean, I was on some network, a few weeks ago, and they were just reading talking points from the Indian embassy, and they were like, "This is going to be great for investment, this and that." It says nothing about it, but the assumption is that it'll drive out a sufficient number of smaller farmers and increase the degree of monopoly power for larger farmers, larger farm conglomerates, which will then increase the investment into sort of labor-saving technology. I guess indirectly it affects how it works, but it's unclear what the direct effects of it will be on direct ownership.
That's your kind of reading on what they intend to do with the land reform bills, but what strike the hearts of the farmers that led them to strike against it? If it's like not explicit, what the direct bill...
It isn't, it's like if you have, we have to look at the composition of the farmers who are doing this, right? It's not farmers in like Bihar really driven by, I mean, Bihar's really abolished their APMC system, but like, 98% of farmers in Bihar are subsistence farmers, right? These are farmers that are not subsistence farmers. They're selling their products. So their class position is is different from subsistence farmers. And a huge proportion of Indian farmers are not subsistence necessarily, but like so close to subsistence that it's like the benefits of and they're not really even often even delivering to mandis, because you have to have access to a lorry and you have to have resources and sufficient amount of surpluses produced to sell into a mandi, right? So all of a sudden, those people who have access to it aren't the kind of poorest farmers, right? That's just a reality. So it's not the issue is not, so what the drive, the kind of motivation was by farmers that were whose position was a slightly different. I was being it was weird. Like I was attacked by these new school Maoists because I did a thing on BBC maybe like 2 months ago when it was first starting.
No, that's when you know you're on the right track.
Yeah, and I was just like, what the fuck is this, man? And they were like, you're like, they were making all kinds of really absurd. They're like, oh, you're like defending the kulaks. Why are they always obsessed with the kulaks? Kulaks wasn't even really a thing, man. Like, I think it's just overblown bullshit. But I mean, it's just like but also it's like, yeah, if you're a kulak and you're opposing, collectivization, whatever you might think of that, that's a reactionary position. But if you're like a kulak and you're opposing like the complete corporatization of the farming sector, it's fundamentally a different antagonism, right? Like even if you take them at their argument. But yeah, whatever, they're obviously crazy. But the difference is that like here it's the composition is different. And this is undermining the price they're getting per product. In the short term, it might actually be that you have overinvestment to drive out the mandis and the APMCs. But in the longer term, there's a recognition by the unions. I mean, by all the unions, really, up and down the country, the farmers' unions, even the more reactionary ones, even the ones that are like tied to BJP or right-wing parties, recognize that this is what's happening. That this is leading to the abolitionment of this system, the MSP system. Minimum support price system. So that recognition is the reason why they're, still, I mean, this is what's so crazy. They're like, in India, I would argue this, and I've tweeted about this a few times, and because my followers are like guilty Westerners, I don't get any love for this, but I'm like, I will argue this until the day I die, that the Indian bourgeoisie is the dumbest bourgeoisie in the world. Hands down. They're just stupid. They're morons.
That's stiff competition.
They're dumb, dude. They're so stupid. It's shocking. But they're like, oh, they're like, and there's also like, they're just flagrant. They're just like all like, oh, these workers, these farmers, they don't know what's going on. Like, this is good for them. And it's like, dude, they're literally dying in their hundreds and freezing to death and staying in the rain and the cold for months and months and months. But in their head, they're like, these monkeys are too stupid to know that like what's good for them. Like, I mean, not only are they dumb, they're just also like, this is why the post-colonial theorists are so stupid. They're like, oh, like Western bourgeoisie is, I mean, they have a point, some of them, like Dipesh Chakrabarti and other people being like, oh, the Western bourgeoisie are much more benevolent, and that's why you have the emergence of the welfare state. This is in Dominance Without Hegemony. And then they say, oh, South Asian bourgeoisie are much more, are much more sort of aggressive and kind of in imposing the violence of capital. It's like there is some truth to that, but then there's also like, I mean, it's obviously absurd. Their position's absurd. But when you meet some of these ghouls, you're like, okay, maybe the post-colonial theorists have a point, but they don't obviously have a point. It's like the drive for, it's clear that they can see that this is going to affect them in the long term. So
I did want to get a grasp on, like, it's hard to grasp as a person living in a practical island, a small island. North Korea is our only connection to the continent, and we're cut off from that. And it's pretty, international news we're pretty isolated from that. It's all filtered. So India, it's just like an exotic place, and the scale of the strike, it's just epic. I just don't know how to come to terms with, like, how to even think about it. So I just wanted to have this small question on what do you have any good examples on how to start thinking about the scale or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, I don't know if any of you have read David Graeber's Direct Action. I think it's actually his best text. But in that, he has a bit where he talks about this bit about scale, where he's like talking about there's an organization in Karnataka, that's the state my family's from, South Indian state, of about 60 million people. And he's talking about the KRRS, which is the Karnataka Raita Ranga Sangha, which is, Raita means farmers. So it's like Farmers Union, the Karnataka Farmers Union. At the time, they had 10 million members in a state of 60 million people. They used to call demonstrations within a day that have 1 million people. They get like 10% of within like 2 days, like 750,000 people. And people were like, what, how did you do that? And they're just like, it's not even, like, imagine, like, if, you're in a political organization in the US, I mean, a union's different, but like a political organization in the US, like a kind of categorized political organization, but we'd be like, okay, we have 20 members, we can bring out like 200 people, right? Here they're like, no, you don't even have to, an individual doesn't even have to bring his like mother and brother there. It's like, if a family of members, even if like there's a large family of 10 people, bring out one person, you're talking 1 million people. So it's like, yeah, I mean, in terms of scale, I mean, India is a hugely, like, obviously in so many ways fucked up country. But one of the good things about, and amazing things about India is that there's this long tradition of people. It speaks to like how much people are fucked, and that you don't really have a welfare state, and people have to look out for each other. I mean, there's a reason why, like, if you look at two trajectories of like, look, for example, Europe with a social pact of Europe around welfare in the post like World War II class compromise, and then you look at the US where it was like, you don't really have a welfare state and you have jails. You have in the US a much more antagonistic, at least in some parts of the US, antagonistic tradition of trade unionism. There's a really good bit about this in Jamie McCallum's book, Global Unions, Local Power. But basically you have a much more antagonistic tradition, whereas in Europe, they don't really have much more. I mean, there's sections that have, like transport unions, etc., dock workers everywhere, really. But basically people are just much more like, they're part of the bureaucracy, right? Because you don't really have a welfare state in India, everyone's in an organization, right? People are in sanghas, people are in trade unions. There's just that tradition that exists. Because you don't really have a welfare state in India, everyone's in an organization, right? People are in sanghas, people are in trade unions. There's just that tradition that exists. Even if you're right wing, you're in a union, right? Like when I was doing sort of union stuff in Bangalore, it's like, it is hot shop organizing because the unions don't have any money in some sectors. But you go to a place and you're like, people just signing up to the union. They're like, of course we'll be in that. Like, no one else is looking out for us. The state doesn't give a shit. I think it's a scale question, but it's also like, I mean, saying that, scale and, PRD from like 2008 to 2018 in terms of protests was like 50,000 spontaneous strikes that were wildcat. It's pretty sick. Even though they're not like political, there's no political organization or trade union really that's independent that they can join. So I guess it's just lots of workers, lots of strikes. It's kind of how it works, right?
Yeah, so for context, 60 billion, South Korea is like 49 million currently. Mm-hmm. And the 1 million was how many people that were organized in 2 days, right? 1 million is... Yeah,
like 750,000. I remember, I think I was reading that in that text, but I don't actually know the specifics, but yeah.
Sure. 1 million is the current total
like 2% of the population of Korea.
Wow. So, and it's amazing when people get at least like a tenth of that in a rally around the country.
Yeah, but in Korea, I've heard that there's all kinds of stuff. Like, isn't there like the tradition of like coming to strike, shaving your head, wearing overalls, and not like your overalls, wearing like workwear and bringing sticks to beat the shit out of cops? That's what I read somewhere.
I guess in the good old days.
Yeah, there are the good old days.
No, I thought that I was holding.
We put down the Molotov cocktails when after liberalizations, and it's not that militant anymore. No, I know the good old days where the leftists of all the around the world went to watch riot porn with South Korean metal workers beating the shit out of.
It's the only porn I watch, really.
That's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
And that's how Mike felt.
That was my first exposure to Labor Notes conference.
Wait, which Labor Notes conference were you at, Mike?
I've been to several. I think one of them was when I made fun of you for like I was joking that you were visiting your summer home in Chicago. I think it was when you were studying in the UK. It was after you know Labor Notes. People would have those all the socialist groups would rent out those hotel suites and have their various parties. All the cadre groups would try to recruit whatever 20-something-year-old wayward university students would show up. It was long ago in a hazy past of our youth, I guess.
Your good old days.
Ashok kind of briefly touched upon it, but the reason why the sheer numbers were possible was because they were all kind of excluded from the welfare state to the extent that it exists. But Modi is having this kind of Hindu nationalist cult of personality around him being built. And I was curious how these farm bills were aggregated into his larger political project of excluding certain members, because I read that the region that the farmers were striking, they're Sikh, so a minority religious portion, they're excluded from the Hindu nationalism. Like I'm probably talking out of my ass here, but I hope the point got across. Like, how does this fit into the political project overall? But I do get a sense that because the Indian bourgeoisie are so dumb, it might not have those connections, but
dumbest bourgeoisie in the world. That's the line. I want to hear you say it.
I love this episode.
I want to hear you say it. I'm allowing you to say it. That's how it works. You're not cancelable when I say that. No, so yes, it is the case that there's this tendency, I think, a little bit to. Okay, yes, it's true that like lots of the people who are driving this are Sikhs. That's been used actually by the state to, again, I'm not like trying to refer to, I'm not trying to like, this isn't like trying to big myself up, but I'm in this interview that I was doing on the BBC, it was so shocking because you're like, okay, this is just like lunatic stuff that like the far right of India like produce, right? Like about, but the anchor on the BBC, she was like, we have indications that like Khalistani militants are part of this protest. It's like Khalistani militants. Khalistani militancy hasn't been a thing for 30 years, dude. Like, it hasn't had a thing since, like, the massacres of the Golden Temple in 1984. Like, it's not a thing. But they're literally like, look at these Sikhs. And they're, like, reading from government propaganda. So, in the sense of, like, they were trying to use that to marginalize them. But the motivations around the bills themselves, I don't really think that I think it's, like, there's lots of other shit that this government is pushing that's obviously super chauvinistic and reactionary. I would say like a lot of the drive around what happened in Kashmir and the withdrawal of parts of the Constitution and allowing for like basically a settler colonial project. I know that's contested to say, but I think that's part of the motivation because it was restricted in Kashmir who could buy the land. It was Kashmiris could only purchase land there, and now they're trying to get rid of that. It's part of a profit motive, but it's also a part of a much more reactionary and like project of trying to expand like the realm of Hinduism, I guess. But I think that's secondary, right? Like I'm always like, I'm of a particular school of thought that thinks, okay, this is like not actually the primary motivation. The primary motivation is with this stuff is like basically Modi is, I mean, when Modi was the head of Gujarat state, he was like pushing these really right-wing reforms. I mean, it's not like, it's not like, and then he was cementing his support amongst corporate elite and those interests. And so that's kind of what this is about, in lots of ways. So it's like both part of the ideology of Modi's it's part of his politics, but it's also like it's an electoral calculation as well. Like you're able to win over urban elites. And the difference in India is like, it's like you go to the US, it's like, it is the case a lot of the times that lots of reactionary politics are in rural areas. And I'm not saying that somehow that's the indication of is that like how big the Democratic Party vote is versus the Republican Party vote. I'm not saying, but what I'm saying is that like, we can basically say that Republicans are more reactionary than Democrats. By and large, people were voting for them. And so you look at the map and, and you look at same in Britain, it's like rural areas are voting with the center-right party or the right-wing party, and the urban areas are voting for the centrist party or left-wing parties. In India, it's an inversion of that. Like people who live in cities are demented, and I hate them. But then people living in rural areas tend to be much more, quite, I guess, they're voting for much more left-wing parties generally. And local parties, they tend to be more left-wing. Depends on the state as well. Like if you go to South India, very, tends to be like, if you look at Kerala, you look at Tamil Nadu, the socialist, by and large, policies or left social democratic politics under the auspices of communism. And it's like also in like West Bengal, obviously. So that's kind of the breakdown of that. But I think in terms of how this fits into a larger program of, Hindu nationalism, it's that you do have this kind of combination. It's also not the case that like Punjab happened to be productive and is driving this, but Haryana, which is controlled by a BJP chief minister and is also hugely involved in these protests. Same with Uttar Pradesh. It is the case that Punjab is led by someone from the opposition, but I actually think it's I don't think it has really. I don't think it's actually driven by chauvinism as much as it is like profits, really, and also liquefying. Like what you can do is basically if you get rid of this, it's also I think there's at some level of political calculation. You're driving out 65-70% of rural areas into cities, and it does have there's a political calculation probably there somewhere. Like electoral calculation, I imagine. I don't know. It's part of primitive accumulation. It's part of like the developmental process in a project in their mind.
I can actually ask something here and rudely butt in, but you mentioned the non-sectarian kind of composition of these farmers' protests, and I read somewhere in New Statesman that these farmers' protests are building a new form of solidarity and identity as a way to combat the ruling party's attempts to use sectarian politics to pit public opinion against these protests. I was wondering if you found that to be accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, anyone who's done like labor organizing can see knows, or any kind of organizing really, knows that like it's like you go and organize a workplace, like workers organizing against management. It's like one of the most like emancipatory feelings for people who are actually doing it and winning potentially, but also it's like sulfuric acid to racism and chauvinism and reactionary politics, because people can see and feel that it's like there's a diverse composition of people that are like fighting with them, and there's a diverse composition of managerial and management and ownership and proprietary class that like is exploiting them, right? That's what you see here, right? Like you see that you have different castes of people, different religions, and they're coming together, and that's of course there's probably like loads of kinds of reactionary politics with individuals who are involved in stuff, but I think through struggle, people see the weaknesses of those kinds of politics that have been largely imposed or encouraged by the state. Like in previous protests, I mean, Kashmir is off limits in India. It's kind of like you go to Israel, no one, like the left doesn't talk about Palestine. This is what I find really annoying when, I mean, not to get off topic, but whenever people are like, well, people, if you go to Israel, loads of people talk about Palestine. I'm like, no, they don't. They're like fascists. Like, they're not talking about Palestine other than to be like, I want to kill Palestinians. But like, similarly in India, it's like Kashmir is off limits, right? And it's like, but what you did see is that, when the Kashmiri stuff happened, they're like, we're going to kill. And then nobody really said anything. Then you look at the Anti-Caa protests. This is the citizenship law introduced about a year and a half ago. A mass protests of this kind of urban intelligentsia that were like against that. So it was very urban in its protests. And they were like, these are urban Naxals. Naxalites were a movement from 1968 that was in Naxalbari in West Bengal that was basically a Maoist struggle. And now it's like a different compositions of peasants that are under the broadly called Naxalites. But anyways, and at one point, maybe like 10 years ago, they controlled a fourth of all taluks in India. So there's like a red corridor that ran all the way from the north, all the way to the north of Kerala. So it was like it was a huge chunk of the country. And anyways, they considered it kind of a huge existential threat. Introduced all these reforms in India, like the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Program, which is the largest employment program in the world, in order to undermine them, right? Like that's where it's like people are like, they wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for the Naxalites. Anyways, they were just like, oh, we're going to they just called everyone urban Naxals. Anyone my brother was called was like defined as an urban Naxal. Like they put out my brother's an actor and an activist in India. And it's like, they just went for everyone, right? And if you look at the protests now, there was a march early on where it was like thousands of people farmers holding like portraits of people, professors, students, like environmental activists, all these different people who'd been arrested and who still detained and who'd been killed by the state. So it was just like an active effort by these farmers to be like, look, we're all in this together, So it's very impressive. I didn't expect that, actually. I was like, wow, that's very impressive. Because you're sticking your neck out for people who had been basically dubbed successfully by the state as terrorists. And that's literally what the state constantly, like anytime you're an it's funny because I'm just going off on one, but I'll say this, like Rihanna tweeted this thing about it. Yeah. It literally broke, that people are like, oh, the internet, it broke India, dude. Like it was crazy. So she tweets this thing just being like, why haven't we heard about this? Or like something like that. Like obviously totally in solidarity, and it's sick that she did that, right? Immediately the Indian state goes into overdrive, starts this like this hashtag Indians against propaganda. And literally all of their like comprador actors and like these little like apparatchiks and appendages, like brain dead Indian elites, start tweeting literally the same exact tweet, like copy and pasted the same exact tweet, like formulated by the state. And it's all like hashtag. So it was like kind of crazy. It was just like, this is nuts, right? They had that obviously and then Greta Thunberg, they were like, she tweeted something, which is great. And then they were like, everybody was like, Greta Thunberg is an agent for China. And so it was like, it was amazing. Everybody lost their minds. And you're just like, people didn't understand like how they were like, wait, I thought Indians, I think that like in the West, the stereotype is like, Indians are so smart. And I'm like, have you met an Indian elite in India? Have you? So anyways, yeah, that happened.
Yeah, I saw that. That was pretty interesting to watch that play out. Yeah, the Rihanna tweet like triggered this whole like propaganda machine. Yeah, I saw that on Twitter. It was like literally, it was almost like they sent out like a notice to all like the managers of these like Bollywood actors. It's just like, everyone tweet this tomorrow at 10 a.m. Yeah, it was like, well, and also, I mean, this was an interesting thing. I guess we're jumping ahead a little bit. We had this question too. There was this like interesting, like, because, Twitter, like obviously cooperates with this kind of shit. The Indian government went to Twitter, requested that they ban all of these activists who were spreading, information about demonstrations and advocating on behalf of the movement or whatever. Twitter totally cooperated in suspending their accounts. I think most of them were later restored. But we also saw some like other, I read about some pretty shocking instances of repression where like there were regional governments that were like threatening to not issue passports for people. They were saying if you participate in these protests, we're going to take your name down. You will be ineligible for any sort of public sector job in the future. Can you talk a little bit about that? The repression and response to the movement?
I mean, the thing is, okay, so in India is a very much, for people who don't know, it's quite a decentralized system. I mean, you always had, since independence, the central government, whether it was like more kind of left social democratic governments like Nehru's government in the immediacy, or it was like more neoliberal government since the late 80s, 90s. There was always a kind of centralization drive, right? And so, but what you had was, you had, for example, in the 1950s, they wanted to institute Hindi as a national language. We don't have a national language in India, despite what all the fascists would like you to believe. In India, we have over 20 languages that are nationally recognized. We have over 200 languages that are actually recognized as like kind of second tier languages. Anyways, the point is that that when they announced that as a kind of illustrative example, like Tamil Nadu, for example, in South India was like ready to basically break up the union. Everybody, like loads of, and then they were like, oh no. So there was like a recognition really of like linguistic states, and you had this kind of process of this constant tension, right? So it really is dependent on the state. So some states have been hugely repressive, and I'm thinking of like places like, for example, Haryana. Haryana literally closed their border and refused people. That's like in the U.S. if like the governor of Iowa closed their border. Like that's literally not happened ever. And so it's like you had like barricades at borders with like people not being allowed to leave. And then you had other states that have threatened really crazy stuff. Karnataka, which is led by the BJP, as well as like other places that had more kind of pro-government forces. But then also, if you go to Kerala, there's been very pro-protesters and, like passed resolutions completely opposing it and in solidarity with workers, or with farmers. So it really depends on the state. But it's quite uneven,
So concerning what Ashok said earlier, so then would it be, in a sense, correct to say that instead of using the farm bills in service of that nationalism, the Indian government is using nationalism against the farm bills, the resistance to erode the resistance against the farm bills and to marginalize it, whereas the struggle by the farmers and the workers is against the farm bill is actually eroding the nationalism, chauvinism a bit.
Yeah, look, I think I'm generally of the school of like a kind of I don't even know if this is the right reference to this, but like a kind of vulgar relationship between the base and superstructure. Like I think it's like there is an economic drive and it's supported by various different forms of kind of rhetorics and actions that are attempting to cement majoritarian rule. Like I think by and large the drive is towards the motivation is often around the accumulation of capital and like lining the profits of lots of supporters. There's electoral considerations here as well, right? But then it's like the secondary, the mechanism by which they do that is by using these kinds of politics of division or whatever, right? So
it's a class agenda rather than like ethnic or cultural agenda in a sense.
Yeah, I think it's both. But I think it's like if we have to measure one versus the other, especially in this instance, it's obviously driven by the optimizing the conditions for capital and then it's like you find a kind of racial fix to like a spatial fix, but a racial fix. You find that you sort of use that as a cudgel to to divide people. I think that's my simple explanation for that. I mean, I'm sure people would contest that, but when it boils down, like, that's really what is like the drive here. In this instance, I think in lots of instances, but especially this one.
Yeah, so obviously farmers' discontent didn't just start with the recent legislation. What are some of the contexts that led up to this? I know there's been tens of thousands of farmer suicides, largely due to debt, for example.
Yeah. So on the farmer suicides, really you saw the rise of farmer suicides since the introduction of the kind of neoliberal reforms and around pesticides. And I mean, you really sort of had this influx into the market from the 60s, but you sort of had it sort of was like pumped since the 90s, really. That's seen as a kind of turning point in the economic system in India, where before that you had a kind of, you had import substitution investment. After that, you have a kind of export-oriented production. And it becomes increasingly difficult and you have a kind of move, basically from like 1989 to 2009, you have this about 15-20% shift from rural to urban. And it's not done through forced relocation in the way that it's done in like China, for example, right? Primitive accumulation in India happens in a much more insidious way of it's not even like the Enclosure Acts in England where, you had laws that criminalized people stepping into the commons and stuff. In India, the way it would happen was that you just made it impossible for poor people to exist in rural areas. You made the indebtedness so high, you made access to certain forms of seeds really onerous. And then you also at a cultural level change as well. I always cite this, not always, but I always think of this example. Like anyone who knows Bollywood films knows, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, especially in the 70s and early 80s, you basically had Bollywood films where it was just again, this is kind of a base superstructure type thing, but Bollywood films obviously very influential in Indian society. But you had the narrative arc was always you have this peasant singing and dancing with wheat, and cities were places of sexual depravity and decadence was eschewed. And so people, it was that was the narrative arc. It was very kind of Manichaean in the sense of rural good, cities and diaspora and Western society bad. And so then when that starts to change really is under neoliberalism, in the 90s, all of a sudden cities rural areas are where the bad guys come from, the dark skinned bad guys. And then it was cities are where, cities were celebrated. And it was that diaspora, there's this film, very famous film, Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge from the 90s, where it was just this rich diaspora, and that's what's celebrated. And that becomes the kind of change. So it's sort of in lots of ways, there were all these built-in incentives in Indian society that were trying to drive people into cities at the level of culture, but also making it increasingly onerous for people to live in rural areas. So then you see this spike of rural suicides in the 90s. And so much so, it's year-on-year increases of rural suicides. And lots of times people killing themselves by drinking the pesticides that were dumped onto the market to make it impossible or difficult for smaller farmers to subsist or even survive. So they, so much so that by 2015, the government of India refused not to distribute any of the numbers around suicides. And they still say that there's every indication that there's about 28 people killing rural farmers in India committing suicide every day. That's over 10,000 a year. So it's a serious issue. But on the question of historical struggles, I mean, there were obviously, and this also speaks to the kind of antagonism between the sort of Communist Party Marxists, which are fairly hegemonic in the sense of they are the ones that control the lots of the political, the states where they had control or power, like Kerala now, West Bengal in the past, and even lots of the ones that they're winning seats in more recently. So there was a struggle in the mid 2000s in Nandigram, and Nandigram was a region in West Bengal where the ruling Communist Party Marxists, basically a number of companies like I think Tata was one of the companies, which is one of the big companies in India, wanted this huge tract of land for like a factory or whatever. And you had a struggle between like lots of potentially Maoist affiliated, Naxalite affiliated groups and individuals in that region. And all of a sudden the state, led by the Communist Party Marxists, murdered dozens of them. I believe dozens, I think it was 28. But, so there was a genuine historic antagonism between these organizations. And I think what's changed now is, for example, the Bharatiya Kisan Sabha is CPM affiliated. One of the largest unions of farmers that's supporting these struggles is that what they've been so marginalized in India, like the kind of communist movement. I'm saying communist, but like obviously we know they're not like.
Yeah, we know you mean that in like a nominal sense.
Yeah. I mean, they're like kind of unreconstructed Stalinists, right? But like they are, I think, they're great in lots of ways, but they're also terrible in lots of ways. But like they are, through that marginality means that like lots of these sectarian divisions, but not even just sectarian divisions, but divisions that are like deeply ideological, right? They're like, okay, they justify the mood that killing in Nandigram by being like, look, there's a stage to capitalism. It's like classic Stalinism, right? They're like stagism. We have to go through these stages. That means that like you guys, we're gonna have to liquefy your lives, make you into wage laborers, and then someday your great grandchildren will own the means of production. So it's like kind of like, it's obviously like insane, but it's also that like that stuff has kind of moved to the back because when you're so marginal, you got to look for friends anywhere, right? And so a lot of these sort of India's deep. The Indian left is like, you think the American left, which is barely existent, is like sectarian. Like, what are you fighting over? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, the fuck are you fighting over? You have nothing. Whereas like in India, they actually controlled states with like 100 million people, hundreds of millions of people, and huge amounts of resources, and they were fighting fascists. So like, yes, I mean, they did have lots of sectarianism, but that like there was a reason for that, you know? Whereas like, because they were doing electoral battles where they were actually winning and losing and, had access to resources. It was like, here, you're like what are you fighting over? You have no power. So, I mean, I'm part of the sectarian left here. So I'm like talking to myself really.
Yeah, I mean, even though I live in the U.S., I'm still part of the sectarian U.S. left as well.
You talked a bit about how a lot of these farmers are kind of complicated because they own land, which most Indian farmers don't. But we've seen reports of how landless farm laborers, not just farmers with their own land, have also joined the movement. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that structure of farm labor in India, and are there any tensions between small farmers and landless laborers?
I think it's like, the drive for it, and the prime beneficiaries are obviously people that have a plot of land and have the resources to like transport goods to the mandis. And so you need a sufficient, it might sound like nothing to get a lorry, transport the goods, but like the marginalities are so slim that like you have to have those resources to make it viable, right? Like we were talking about earlier. But what the struggle has done is in lots of ways generalize that struggle, like it's like people can see that there's a genuine bona fide struggle, 100 days, people really struggling for so long that lots of different sections are now joining. I mean, historically, of course, there was the antagonism comes from like the position of class. Like you have landless people being antagonistic towards people who have land and employ them is a class struggle, right? It's like, it makes sense. But right now, I think there's a recognition that this struggle is something that they can all benefit from. Now, there is a kind of argument that some have made, and these are the kind of government talking points that say, okay, they're not wholly illegitimate. That says, okay, this holds intact the existing structures, right? It does do that. It keeps intact. It kind of keeps in place and ossifies in lots of ways an existing structure. But again, this goes back to the Maoists' critique, the new school Maoists, which are the worst kinds of Maoists, as we all know, are like it doesn't. It's there is some basis in reality in what they're saying, but it's like you have to analyze it from the kind of material conditions that exist in India. Like, it isn't a struggle against a communist movement that's trying to break up the lands, right? If that was the case, I'm not going to stand with these landed. They're not landed. Okay, that's an extent. They have land, yes, but like, and they do have land enough to like have enough surplus to sell that, but they're not landed in that. I mean, some of them might be, but not in the same sense. Like, you don't have 300,000 landed people in Punjab, right? Like, that's like, that doesn't mean make any sense. The scale of it just doesn't make the critiques of what the government's saying, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because they're like, these are just the elites. I'm like, 300,000 just there, but you're talking like tens of thousands in all kinds of other states. I mean, how could that even make any sense, right? So there is a sense that this is a larger struggle. It's also that like it is an existential struggle for Modi in lots of ways, because you can marginalize the Kashmiris. I mean, they literally make their mark by marginalizing a people that they occupy, a land that they occupy. But the thing is, and they can also marginalize urban protests like the CAA protests against the citizenship law. But it's really hard in Indian society, that the 1980s kind of, singing farmer thing, that has some resonance. And people, like, it's really hard to like say these people, especially at that scale, it's really hard to say, okay, they are these like, they're these fringe elements, right? Like it's become very difficult for the government. So there's a recognition by different sections of society, different kinds of compositions, like whether they be, landless farmers or peasants, yeah. And I mean, that's what they are, right? Whenever I say that to like non-Marxists, they're like, why would you call them that? I'm like, it's just a definition of your relationship to land, really, and to landed people. It's not like I'm like, they're idiots, even though Marx did kind of call them idiots. But it doesn't matter. The point is that like those different sections are like, okay, we can win here, and there's a large. They're even if they might not have that much of a stake with the laws themselves.
It's something I can only speak about this from an American context. I lived in Iowa for a couple of years, where farmers have a very weird, complicated place in society and economy, right? It's like back in the 1930s, the Communist Party organized farmers with a holiday association. And I was wondering, do you think, talk about new school Maoists, do you think like the left, I don't want to say it's like in general, but in general should redefine how to view sort of farmers in a sense of own land and sell some of their surplus, but it may not really be fair to call them small business owners, because they do have long history with working with the labor movement and other working class groups.
Well, I mean, I think the Midwest is a bit different in the U.S. Like, you obviously had like family farm movements in Wisconsin. I mean, you had these kind of farmers. I mean, when they had these huge tractor rallies in India, and I remember seeing images of like the protests in like 2010, 2011, where you had these kind of farmer tractors coming in and doing these protests for like against the labor laws that were being passed in, like the anti-union laws that were being passed in Wisconsin. And, you had a kind of farm labor political movement in Minnesota, for example, and it's still called I think Farm Labor Party or something, the Democratic Party there, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, I feel like Mike knows about this. Yeah. Corn-raised Mike. I mean, I don't even know where Mike is from, but I'm just going to say he's corn-raised. I'm
from Tennessee. Do not confuse me for a Midwesterner. But I know what you're talking about. There is this sort of like, some of these Midwestern states, Vermont, I think has one too. You have these sort of like quixotic holdovers from like 19th century, early 20th century, like farm. It'll be like, there's like 5 people in the state legislature who are like the Democratic Farm Labor Party. And it's just like nostalgic.
It's like, I think the consolidation of farming in the US, I mean, the composition of farmers is like, it's completely hegemonized by huge farmers, right? So the composition is just fundamentally different. Like, this isn't like, it's not the 1920s and 30s where you might have had a composition that was like different and organizable, right? But even then, they weren't organizing farmers. I mean, the dominant organization of the Communist Party, my understanding, were sharecropper organizations that were like largely landless, right? So I'm thinking of like, for example, like Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe, in Alabama, the kind of rural organization there. And I think that like, you do have obviously Maoist organizations in the US that are like, we have a Sunbelt strategy, not naming any names. And
there's like 5 people from New York who like moved to Arizona, and they're like, "This is our."
No, not Arizona, man. Durham, North Carolina. Come on, bro.
Well, yes. All right. Well, we're gonna get in trouble for this. Let's not go into that.
Yeah, I'm gonna get canceled by those 5 people in a country I haven't lived in for over a decade. But yeah, I think So I think it's that. I think it's like, I don't think we can just be like, oh, let's. I was talking to someone else about this. They're like, what kind of lessons can Americans learn from what's happening here? I'm like, not really anything. Like, I don't mean like, I think it's like, you can learn that like, sometimes you got to just organize a massive encampment and not leave. That's what you can learn, Like, but I don't think it's like, now you should go out and organize like farmers. In India, farmers are like small-ish farmers and farmers that are like, I mean, it's also kind of crazy. They're like these rich farmers. I'm not going to harp on all of this. It's like these rich farmers are literally living on the back of a truck for months, like in the pouring rain, in rags. Like that doesn't even make any sense. Anyways, whereas like in the US, it's like the proportion of farming produce that are produced, 90 whatever percent, 95%, whatever, are produced by huge farmers. The kind of social power that small farmers would have is like inconsequential. Like they just don't have the power to do anything. So I think like when people always like, people have a total misunderstanding of, I think, Marx, where they'll be like, they are just talking about they just like only care about workers in industrial like sectors because it's like male pale and stay. I'm like, no, listen. The reason why the Marxists talk about the most valorized sections of capital and the workers that work there isn't because we're like, these people matter more than like a sex worker or like a cleaner. Obviously, as humans, they don't matter more. It's that they have more social power because we live under a system called capitalism. And that capitalism means that like some people who produce certain kinds of things in society have more power than other people who don't produce those things. So it's like, that's just a question of power. It's an analysis of power, right? So it's like, I always refer to like recent struggles. Like you look at like, Tunisia, Egypt, those struggles in the Arab Spring, and then you look at like the Green Movement in Iran, problems notwithstanding, and then also like the red shirts in Thailand, huge mass movements that were popular, that were taking over squares, The reason why Egypt and Tunisia were like at least successful in like upending the existing, government order, social order in some ways, Tunisia more than Egypt, is because they called it, after the mass protests that are taking over the squares, they called a general strike on day 16, day 18 and successfully did it, which like brought the government to its knees. So our analysis of capitalism means that like, we're not just like being like, oh, we have to just organize the most marginalized sections of society. Great. If you're doing that, props. But it's like, we have limited resources. In that limited resources, we're organizing 10 workers who work at a dock or 10 workers that, I don't know, are academics. I can guarantee you that the dock workers have more power. I go on strike, people are like, get fucked, bro. So
self-flagellation. That gets injected into like.
Yeah, of course we should organize all these people. So I'm saying like organizing farmers in India makes a lot of sense because India, it's a huge part of the composition of India. It's still like, in the US, who are we going to organize, right? Like, what's a farmer in the US? It's just like some dickhead who gets a huge amount of subsidy from the government.
The 250 million people strike that was in solidarity with the farmers. So what were, partially in solidarity with the farmers, as you said. So what are some of the other demands raised by that strike? So was there any long-term thing? You said it was only for like a day or so. Was there any long-term agenda that was behind it? And how much of that is overlapping with the farmers' struggle?
So my memory is that there were 7 demands with that strike. Part of it was actually, I think one of them was to rescind the farmers' laws, the anti sort of farmers' laws reforms. And then a number of them addressed the labor reforms that were introduced. So one of them was about, in order to get recognition, I think they'd expanded the proportion of the workforce that the workers had to get. That was part of it. Also, that in order to go on strike, they had to they changed the notification rules around that. Also, it made it easier for larger employers to fire workers. Obviously, this is about optimizing the conditions for transnational capital, obviously, and the domestic bourgeoisie in India. Just as a reflection of how horrific and ghoulish the Indian creamy layers are. They were I was in a gym in India, trying to get jacked, and so I was I was there, and there were these two. This is a year, not year. This is 4 or 5 years ago. There was these two douchey looking corporate guys, just working out, talking. I never really listen. I just do my own thing. But I was listening in on this, and they would just passed a law in the neighboring state of Tamil Nadu called 1 rupee rice. Basically, it's 1 rupee rice. So 1 rupee for a packet of rice that you can feed 3 people with. So it's basically free, right? Rice, just free rice. That's just the program in Tamil Nadu. It's not that deep. These guys were everyone's fleeing Bangalore, which has a huge number of Tamil Nadu workers, fleeing to go back to Tamil Nadu. And they were just whining about this, right? I had to just interrupt. I'm wait a minute. You're telling me that their wages are so shit that it was all they needed was a 1 rupee rice incentive to leave, right? That's how bad it is in India. So, the reforms in India is obviously trying to address some of that. And also, I think one of the reforms was about expanding the Mahatma Gandhi rural employment program. So this was introduced in I think it was in the mid 2000s. Basically, it was targeted in the red corridor. So it was saying anyone who wants a job can get a job and they're paid. And I think it's 80% are women who take this up. And if there's no jobs available, you can say you're going to do this or that task and they'll pay you. I think it was about expanding that program. It is an expansive program. So if you're in a rural taluk, then you can have access to that program. And it was also about, I think, increasing the amount of remuneration around that as well. So that's my understanding. But it's a series of fairly defensive demands. I don't think any of them are that's how it's been really for the last 30 years. Most of the demands are defensive in the sense of preserving this or that institution that existed in India, or this regulation or that regulation. Not making new ground or taking new ground.
So how is this $250 million strike mobilized? How is this organized altogether? So
there are 11 union federations. I think it's 11 union federations in India, 6 primary ones, affiliated to the major political parties as well. And I believe all of them called the strike, bar maybe one, the BJP one. But in the past, all of them called these strikes for various things. And so it's the workers in those sectors, banking and places that have high union density, industrial unions that aren't labor intensive, more capital intensive labor, industrial unions like auto workers and stuff, all kind of go on strike on these days. But also it's kind of it's not so much like this, but in France, it's 9% union density. But when they go on strike, 90% of people go on strike because their negotiation, the lowest rung of their negotiation is a universal, right? So if they increase a variable minimum wage of 16 to 19 francs or whatever, the 16 will be applied to the 90%. So it's there's a direct material reason why 90%, even if union density is fairly low. In India, it is the case that once there is this kind of strike called, lots of different parts go on strike, even if they have relatively low union density. I think it's not really organized in the same way, and I'm not in any. I've historically not given that much weight to these things, so that means I haven't really paid that much attention to it. But my understanding is that it's kind of called. I mean, these are just like really rusty unions. I mean, in lots of ways, they're really impressive as well. Like in Bangalore, they have gone from like, and there's also an indication of how much Bangalore's expanded, but they've increased by like threefold, I think, since the 90s, in their union density. And they have lots of different organization and arms and in terms of like sections that they organize. So it's not like totally unimpressive, but it is very, very bureaucratic. And so I think what they do is they put the word out, and then people organize it in their areas. But it doesn't feel like it's like there's a lot of organization necessarily going into it. I'm never really that impressed by him. It just feels like May Day, which is fine. May Day's cool, but it's also like no employer's like, oh, we're shaking in our boots. It's May Day. Oh, people are like, oh, it's May Day.
It's like MLK Day in the U.S., right? It's sort of like a symbolic, important in some ways, but yeah, it's not threatening to the system. Well, this actually is a good segue into our next question, which is about, we talked about the farmers movement. There's several different farmers union. You already talked about the primary one. I won't butcher the Indian pronunciation. But you also touched on how the fact that like in India, we do have these like mass, at least nominally, communist parties. There's like a Marxist-Leninist one. There's a Maoist one. There's the Naxalites, which are their own kind of...
The Marxist-Leninist one is the Maoist one.
Oh, really? All right. Yeah, I can't keep track of the alphabet soup.
It's not like... It depends if you're saying Marxism, Leninism, or Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism, you're a bit like, you're out there, bro. But Marxism, Leninism, I'm like, great.
Well, it's good to know that they have the same problems that we have in the U.S. in terms of the alphabet soup. But there's a lot more social weight and the stakes are higher in India. So, these parties can actually like marshal a lot of like, they can marshal popular support. They can marshal mass movements. They have organic connections, structural connections to trade unions. They have strong electoral bases. I mean, there's a couple, regions in India that have had communist governments for a number of years. What has been the relationship between the organized socialists and, again, nominally communist, whatever we want to call it, left, and this farmer struggle? Because I'm curious, like, this farmers movement, the main farmers union, does that have any relationship with any of these communist or socialist parties? Like, how is the left, the organized socialist communist left, intervening in these farmers movements? Were they already there on the ground? Is there like a large contingent of farmers who are already organized and constituents of these parties? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's like, you did have, like I said before, you did have this kind of understandably, historical kind of, you had the kind of Sino-Soviet split, which was reflected in the Indian context and South Asian context broadly. And then you had various different historical antagonisms between these different organizations. But then you did have these political organizations like the Communist Party Marxist. This is CPI, parentheses, Marxist, versus the just Communist Party India, which is the original Communist Party, which is like, Communist Party Marxists are better, but it's also Communist Party Marxists, it's just better for lots of reasons. But they're just also like, they also have had power, right? They've had power in West Bengal. They had power in Kerala. Kerala, we say for a long time, EMS Namdipa in 1957 was the first democratically elected communist government, big C communist government in the world. And it's like, you did have this kind of weird relationship, but then these organizations created these various Kisan Sabhas, which are like kind of farmers' unions. And those farmers' unions, because they were well resourced and they were also like part of national organizations, became large and became well resourced and became dominant, right? So the relationship is very direct, right? Like that's one of the ways in which they've also attempted to marginalize them. It's that you do have a lot of like, you also have a lot of unions that are like Gandhian socialists, right? Gandhian socialists kind of, because Gandhi was, he wanted to preserve rural life, and he thought, cities were just like depraved. So it's kind of like if you look at lots of these farmers unions and they have some kind of political affiliation. Lots of the big ones. They may not be with the dominant communist parties, but lots of them have. I mean, if you look at the kind of acronyms in India, like each state has like dozens of political organizations that have various unions that are connected to them. And so, yeah, it's direct. The relationship is direct. It's uneven. It depends on which state. Like, you come to like southern states, it's a bit more direct, the relationship between these kind of communist organizations and the political parties. Whereas if you go to like places in which communists have been weaker, the relationship is also weaker, but you still have political organizations. Like in Haryana or Gujarat or UP, Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh, these states kind of the reactionary belt. I mean, Punjab isn't reactionary, but the other ones, obviously Gujarat is a horrible place, but there's much weaker relationship between the Communist Party, in Gujarat used to be quite good, quite strong. Like I was at a communist camp in Kerala like 2 years ago. And there was this older kind of organizer who used to be with the Communist Party, for years when he was younger. And he was saying this story about how in Gujarat he was this was in the mid '60s. He was a organizer with the Communist Party, and there had been this kind of attack, like a fascist attack, and so they set up these kind of anti-fascist meetings, they were just doing some organizing there around that. So he was tasked with organizing those. So he organizes the first meeting, and then there's this like young guy who comes there, and he's like, "Oh, what? Don't you know how the Indian left operates? Like, you must be new. We always start like a half an hour late. Let's go have some tea." So this happened every week as they organized it, week in, week out. And this young organizer would come there very diligently. And only like decades later, he said that he realized and saw that this was actually a young Modi who was sent by the local RSS, which are like Nazis. I'm not just saying that as hyperbole. Like they love Nazis. They're Nazis. They're organized around like they have basically like kind of brown shirt style organization. They have like, they're a huge organization that is like, far right militant organization that Modi was. This isn't conspiratorial. It's like very well known. Was a organizer for since he was like 16 or 15 or and he like lived in their little like cult place for like and like cleaned. He was like, the way it works is it's like you move into one of those places and then you like basically the children like take care of the place as the organizers go out and do their proselytizing or whatever. So it's like and he was in there from a very young age and then he doesn't even really distance himself from that history, but it's kind of mad. Sorry, again, I'm going off on one, but I always thought that was like a bit crazy, but also like kind of just crazy. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there is this weird. I read about this a little bit. There's the what's her name? She's a famous she's Indian, but she became this like sort of like neo-Nazi like figure. Her name escapes me, but yeah, there is this weird nexus between like Hindu nationalism and then like Nazism. I guess it plays into the whole like Aryan thing.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's like there is an Aryan thing.
I kind of went down a rabbit hole one time, and it was like, what?
India, obviously, like, there's this contestation where they're like the South and the left generally will say, okay, there's this and it's also historically accurate. You did have a Aryan invasion from like what is the Caucasus, and that invasion fundamentally changed the composition of India. And you do have this kind of, like one of the two great epics in India is one of them is called the Ramayana. And Ramayana is basically an allegory for the Aryan invasion of India, where you have this kind of upper caste royalty that's kidnapped by this 10-headed Rakshasa from Lanka, what is Sri Lanka, and then he goes through the south his wife is kidnapped, and he goes through the south, and the only things he comes across are like monkeys and other Rakshasas, or like monsters. So this becomes an allegory of like friendly tribes versus antagonistic tribes. So anyways, this is kind of a historical context in which Aryanism is like kind of owned by potentially some more reactionary elements in India. It is sections like you do have groups like I would say Shiv Sena in Maharashtra, and the RSS, the VHP as well, like very, very much in that tradition. But RSS is particularly like celebrates the kind of Nazi tradition. I mean, in India, it's also like the number one sold English book is still Mein Kampf. But that's not because Indians are reading that shit. It's because brain dead bourgeois Indians are like, I've heard of that book. Let me get it. And they're not reading anything. They're not, who's reading in India? Like, obviously the working classes are reading, the working class are reading, but the elites aren't reading anything. But they're like, I remember one time I was with a friend who's from Germany, and we went to a gathering. That was like a party. And this guy who owned the place was like, I was like, oh yeah, like blah, 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 blah. He's like, oh, where are you from? This is a white guy. And then he was like, I'm from Germany. And the guy's like, oh, land of Hitler. And the guy was like horrified. He's like, what? But like, this is just like, he's like, you're an idiot. You're a brain dead Indian fucking elite. And you just know one thing. You're like, Mein Kampf, Hitler. You don't even know anything about it. So, I mean, I don't even think the fact that they it sells the most is an indication of how fascist India is. It's just like, it's just an indication of how stupid these elites.
Well, this is the thing. I said this video to the guys on here. There was this was a few years ago. There was a bar that opened in Seoul that was like, I think it was probably just, I would hope it's a product of just like historical ignorance, but it was a Nazi themed bar in Seoul, South Korea.
You should send that video.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like I'm not familiar with like what World War II history is taught like in like, you know, South Korean high schools, but yeah, it was like all this and they interviewed the guy and he was like, what's the big deal? It's just it's like a punk rock. Like he was viewing it as sort of like the way that like punk rock bands in like the 70s would sort of like be edgy and appropriate kind of like fascist aesthetics. They weren't actually fascist, but it was just sort of like they were trying to be so punk rock. They were trying to adopt the most edgy aesthetics possible. And that's sort of the vibe. But of course, you know, some like German like university student at like SNU shows up at that place and is just like, what in the actual fuck is going on?
Yeah. No, totally.
So it's not unique to India. There is
inversely, though, you know how like the swastika is taken by the Hitler. It's like it's kind of it's turned or inverted and it becomes the so they take the swastik in India and it becomes a swastika. But the thing is, I remember like on Twitter, like these, I think it was idiot Americans were like, I can't believe India still, you see this everywhere, like the swastika. I'm like, this symbol predates Nazi Germany by thousands of years. My grandmother is literally putting that symbol everywhere. She's not a Nazi. She doesn't even know what the Nazis are. She's like just doing this because that's a symbol. That's like a Hindu symbol. They're like, they need to change it. And I'm like trying to argue, like reason. I'm like, I understand where you're coming from. You're clearly an idiot. This is the history. They're like, we don't care. This is what it means now. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't mean this to Indians, you idiot.
I had this exact same experience because like in South Korea, like, you know, there's a huge percentage of the population that's Buddhist. And like, I go hiking a lot. And when you go in the mountains, you find Buddhist temples and there are swastiks, the direction is reversed. I guess swastiks is the proper term. But anyway, when I came here, I was like, I noticed it because I'm like, well, that's sort of shocking to see these everywhere. But I knew the context. And I would just like be posting, I just moved to Asia, posting pictures on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And then people were like, oh my God, Mike, you're hanging out with Nazis? And I'm like
Mike, this is the problem. You were too sympathetic for too long with the woke people, dude. That's the problem. It's a legacy of your past. It's coming back to haunt you. That's what I think it is. You know what I mean? You just loved that shit before. You loved it. And you're like, why are all these woke people attacking me? It's like, you made your fucking bed, bro. Now sleep in it.
Thank you, Ashok. We tried to drill that in. It's taking time, but I think we're getting into it.
This is why I don't have a Twitter
Mike, you can't
account.
be complaining about this. We have this song in India, in Karnataka. It goes, "Bettara nelandu maneya maadi mrugagali gantaya." It means you can't build a hut on the top of a mountaintop and whine and cry about the sounds and roars of the tigers and elephants. That's you, dude. You can't build a life around woke-tastic people and then whine about the roars and the bellowing of their Instagram.
I'm not whining. I'm just enjoying the humor of it.
I think we should keep this section in, but
This is a Patreon bonus episode.
We'll put on a dunce cap on Mike and get.
No, it's all good. This is why I do not have a Twitter account anymore.
Ashok, so do you think there's a chance for the struggle? So how much chance do you think the struggle has in basically winning, basically making it so that the legislation does not pass? So, and if so, what's going to happen to the movement afterwards, and what's going to be the impact to the Indian left in general?
Well, okay, I think it's a few things. I think it's that, firstly, they've been through the difficult bits. It's like, how long? Okay, there's a very specific thing here where you're like, how long can hundreds of thousands of people stay in one place and sustain that, right? They stayed through the coldest, rainiest winters. Also, because it's seasonal, it's not, you don't have the period until like basically summer. And they could survive there a few more months. And also, so that obviously is one factor to consider. The other thing is that the government basically gave in on a very minor bit, which was like they'd withdrawn this kind of electrical subsidy for lots of rural areas, and they sort of gave in on that. A very minor thing that people want, but it indicates certain kinds of cracks. They're like, oh, we've given in on most of the demands, blah, blah, blah. It's like people are like, cool, whatever, you gave us that, doesn't change anything. So then, they've had 11 negotiations. Every time the government, when it happens, the negotiators, even before it happens, they're like, we don't expect anything, right? What that means is like, there's a level of confidence with people and organization and mobilization that is really, really hard to, it hasn't shown any signs of weakening. It hasn't at all. Like, that's not me just be blindly like, there's parts of the left. I mean, this is what I kind of find annoying about the trot left. The trotty left. This is just me shitting on
Mike here.
They're like any kind. There's a movement. They're like, oh my god, this is a movement. And you're just like, come on, man. Can we just be a little bit sober minded in this? Like, it's just like this. They're just creaming themselves every time. Oh my god, this is the movement. This is when it happens. But yeah, so it's just like I actually think we have to be quite sober minded and be like, okay, what is going on here? Government is obviously on the back foot. They have they're increasing, they're escalating in terms of how many people, like they're slowly escalating. So they're growing in strength, growing in numbers, expanding. It's kind of like, the government's throwing everything at them, and it hasn't weakened them, it's strengthened them. So it's kind of like, I don't know what the end result of this is going to be, but like, no matter what happens, if they go home right now, the government is significantly weaker and the ruling party is significantly weaker than when it started, right? So it's like, no matter what happens at this point, it's a win. It's a huge win. Because it's actually like pierced the kinds of like it was unacceptable to be even remotely critical of. They were just arresting people who were like, I mean, I think political cartoons are lame. Like, I've never been impressed by political cartoons. People are like, check out this political cartoon. I'm like, it's not even funny. I've never laughed at a political cartoon. It's just stupid. Generally, they're just stupid. But like, they would do like this even mild critiques of the government, and they'd like throw them into an Indian dungeon for a month. So it was like, this guy didn't. Okay, there was this Muslim guy. Obviously, it was because he was Muslim. But they were like, he didn't even make a joke. They were like, we feel like he's gonna make a joke. So they went and they kidnapped him from his house and they threw him in an Indian dungeon. So it was just like, well, he hasn't even made the joke. They're like, we feel like he's going to make a joke. So it was like that. But now everyone's making fun of the government. Like, it's moved more and more mainstream. Like, not mainstream, but it's like, they've battened down the hatches. But, all around them, you have forces that are getting strength and confidence in just, and so it's like, it's a chink in the armory, right? Like, increasingly. So I think that's my kind of fairly conservative, actually, assessment. I think they're in a very good position. It's very impressive. I didn't think it was going to be like this. I think early days, I'm like, they're just going to get crushed into a million pieces. And now I'm like, holy shit, I can't believe this. It just speaks to how badass these guys are. Like, it's just like, they've just stayed there. They've been beaten. They've been restricted. They created barricades so they couldn't even leave the place. They broke the barricades. Like, hundreds of them have died, freezing. They're also like cut off all their food supply, cut off all the internet, tried to strip them of any, like, they got a little bit of donation, strip them of that, freeze assets. And they're still like, yo, we're still here. You're gonna have to bury us here. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing.
Well, yeah, one thing reading about this, the recurring thing, like looking at these interviews, especially the role of women, which is maybe something we should talk about with this, is like a recurring thing in these interviews, which is kind of dark, but also sort of inspiring in a way, is that people were just like, fuck it, like, I'm ready to die. Like, that was a recurring thing in all these interviews that I saw with like these farmers. And not even just farmers, there would be like, the sons of a farmer, and like, he'd be like, fuck it. Like they're taking everything away from us. I'm standing my ground. I'm going to die, which again is a very like dark and somber tone, but it's also kind of inspiring.
Is it dark? I feel like the tradition of martyrdom needs to be reintroduced, or at least introduced into Western society. I don't know. They already exist in Western society, but maybe in American society. But it's like, I actually think it's like there is a tradition of this kind of would you die for a cause thing. And they're like, they can see how heavy and important this is. And when you have all the forces against you and you're like, all I have are my comrades on the left side and the right side, shoulder to shoulder, you're like, yeah, I'm going to die with these people. And it'll be for a just cause. I mean, I don't mean that I'm not celebrating. I'm not like being like, yeah, people should die. I'm just saying it speaks to their resolve, It does. I also think that like, yeah, I mean, people have died, It's not like it's, just the government figures. I don't think it's the government figures, actually. The official figures, like basically the Indian mouthpieces of like, Times of India and shit, is like 250. And I think the unofficial numbers, or the numbers that are put up by the union, is like closer to 400, right? It's crazy. Yeah, I mean, it is obviously... and obviously lots of the leadership are women.
Well, I was like reading about this, like in the lead up to this show. And like, I watched a few interviews with these women who were like, yeah, I've never really, these are like very rural kind of like subsistence farmers. And they were like, yeah, I've never really gone out of my house that much. I've always been sort of like a, home mother or whatever. But it's like, this is the first time I'm part of a movement. And then like, she was also talking about how like great it is that like the women would go out on strike because that like had like a bigger resonance in terms of like their participation in the movement. And then like men for the first time were like cooking and preparing meals for their wives. And so there was this like interesting, like through the movement, there was sort of like a breakdown in like the traditional gendered allocation of labor. And like these women just talking about how like for the first time they're out of their house, they're not, stuck on the farm and like dividing their time between rearing children and, doing tasks related to farming. They're actually joining this like mass movement. It was kind of very touching, just like listening to their interviews and stuff.
It's obviously it's incredible. I don't know. Also, the gender division of labor is less clear. With the division of labor is still very gendered, but it's not the same as kind of like social reproducer, material producer that you find under like total subsumption of capitalism, right? Like, I mean, you actually don't even find that really now as much because it's like deprivations reach such high levels that like each are social reproducing and material producing. But do you know what I'm saying? Like, I think it's a bit more of a shared relationship. Obviously, it's still very divided, but that's my understanding, at least from the state I studied, which is Karnataka. But it's still amazing, obviously.
Again, just want to kind of going back to like, when I was, when I lived in Iowa, one thing I kind of like discovered was that Iowa is the home state of Norman Borlaug, who people see as the main architect of the Green Revolution. And I could be wrong here, but from what I insinuated, the Green Revolution was exporting a lot of these corporate farm practices that were used to essentially devastate the American agricultural economy. That's why we see like such high suicide rates of farmers. That's why like small farmers don't really exist anymore. It's mostly corporate factory farms and such. And I wanted to ask how much the Green Revolution has played an effect into corporate consolidation of India's farm economy.
Yeah, it played a huge effect on it. I mean, it's like it was part of the Green Revolution was part of a kind of cocktail of reforms that also included actually the introduction of the APMC and the MSPs, which were like moving towards kind of crops that were had high yield. Also, the introduction of a number of different kinds of products like pesticides and also like certain kinds of seeds and various different kind of farming practices that made it so that people with access to those kinds of things which became increasingly prohibitively expensive, also consolidated those kinds of power. So it's like, you have certain rural more capitalist farmers being able to, there's a kind of capitalist in the sense that they have a huge number of employees in their labor. They have investment in kind of labor saving technology, are able to then have access to those both technologies, but also like seeds and farming practices that then mean that they're able to consolidate more and more power. And it also means that you're able to marginalize more and more small farmers, even if there's restrictions on how much of the land those small farmers can sell to those big farmers in certain areas. It means that they're increasingly not competitive, right? And they become more and more subsistent because it's not effective to sell it to the market. So I think, green revolution played an enormous role in changing the kind of composition of rural India, but there were still restrictions. And I think that's what these laws, and I think the laws that this is intended to lead to, are meant to kind of finish the job that the Green Revolution didn't do. And that's been the accusation by these unions. And I think there's a lot of legitimacy to that.
So the question I had was whether the farmer struggle is connected to any other movements, whether directly or indirectly abroad. And so what kind of repercussions internationally in Asia and around the globe that we might expect afterwards?
I think in general, I would say that the thing about farmers' movements that they tend not to be as internationalist, right? Like, what is it that, we talk about, like, how like the Great Doubling, like between 1973 and 2000, you had a great doubling of the international working class because people move from peasant to working class as capital expands. What that does is it basically increases the worker as a social force globally. And there's more linkages between, quite literally, because people are working for the same companies, but greater linkages between workers around the world generally. There's a possibility for solidarity more generally, more than farmers. Like, farmers generally there isn't that much of a tradition of internationalism that I can think of with farmers. Because lots of the demands are very specific to that area and to that state or that region. I think in terms of like solidarity actions that people have taken with farmers, the places where you've seen the greatest actions, and you saw that happen in Birmingham here, you had it in London here, you had huge demonstrations, you also had huge demonstrations in Canada, is places with large Punjabi populations. So that's where you see the demonstrations at their highest point. In Canada and England have large Punjabi populations. So that's the kind of response internationally. But to be honest, they don't. My understanding is that there isn't many connections outside of India, but that's not because the particularities of this specific struggle. I think that's particularities of the composition of farmers generally.
So if our listeners wanted to continue following the development of this struggle, what's a good source of information? Is there like an English language?
I think a good
website or a news outlet.
A good website is The Wire. It's a kind of critical left, but without being like, it's still a news source, is what I'm saying. It's not like the Socialist Worker or something. So it's thewire.india or something, .in. And that's a good source. That's kind of where I kind of get my latest information. And they're very sympathetic to the farmer struggle. So I've been eating popcorn. Has that been making an annoying noise?
No.
No.
Oh, great. I'll continue then.
Hopefully Tim can edit that out as well.
Well, you can edit out the popcorn crunching noise.
I don't know. He does the magic.
You recently wrote a very interesting book, Monopsony Capitalism, which I've been reading, and I want you to...
Have you? Wow. That's great. I'm glad to hear that.
I bought a copy from a worker-owned bookstore and had it specially delivered to South Korea. No. But anyway, Monopsony Capitalism, your new book, is very interesting. And one thing I really like about this book, I'm still working my way through it, is that it's rigorously academic in terms of the research, but also your writing style is like very exciting, and you weave in like lots of anecdotes about doing stuff actually on the ground. So you're not some just sort of like distant observer in your London tower, like looking down and just reading data. Like you weave in these like really interesting stories of like you in these places, being a translator for like union activists. So the book is about the transformations in the garment sector industry. So talk a little bit about your book, Monopsony Capitalism.
So yeah, thank you for that. That's very kind. The book is based on research in a number of different contexts and has a series of cases from Honduras, China, India, and bits from Vietnam, but that didn't make the final cut. I mean, they did kind of bits, but not really. And interviews with activists in like Cambodia and Turkey and other places. But basically, it's the argument of the book is that you have a kind of it's you know, garment sector and labor intensive sectors more generally, footwear, are helpful ways of analyzing the sector, analyzing industrial capital more generally, because they're starter sectors. They're first to come, they're first to go in the developmental process because they're so labor intensive and don't have that much investment in capital. They're also outsourced. They've always been outsourced, meaning there's a separation between the buyers and the sellers and the producers of the product. So, you know, you walk into a Nike shop or a shop that sells Nikes and you buy a pair of Nikes. You know, Nike basically owns none of the production process and owns the swoosh, the brand. People are aware of this kind of dynamic, and what that means is that it fundamentally changes the relationship and the distribution of value across those supply chains. So monopsony, that word just means like a kind of buyer's market. It means that buyers have the power in the supply chain. It's kind of inverse of monopoly. Monopoly is like, let's say you have, you know, 3 shoe companies that have 33% each of the global shoe market, and one kind of takes over another one, and that has 66% monopoly power, degree of monopoly power. Monopsony is a kind of inverse. It's like the relationship between that shoe company and the various elements of that shoe. So like the rubber soles and the producers of those rubber soles, or like, you know, the laces, producers of those laces, you know, so it's like a vertical relationship versus a horizontal relationship. So if you have many, many sellers and few buyers, it means you have this inverse relationship. It's kind of it's the same. It's used in the labor market analysis. So let's imagine we're all workers and Mike is an employer, right? So then if there's only one job, we're competing against each other for that job. There's a degree of monopsony there, right? Let's say there's 4 times as many workers. That degree of monopsony is greater. And there's more people willing to do that job for less and less. And so Mike has more power now. And so, but what I'm arguing in the book and what you demonstrated over the last 100 years is that over time, this monopsony relationship means that, like say Mike is Nike and we're various suppliers. Over time, he's putting downward pressure on the production of a shoe or a shirt or whatever. And over time, that means that like the price demands go down and fewer suppliers are able to compete. As fewer and fewer suppliers are able to compete, the ones that die, let's say I'm the one who's producing these cheap products, I'm occupying and increasing my degree of monopoly power. As that happens, it means that value relationship in terms of Mike extracting increasing numbers of value becomes more distributive because, you know, the disruptive power of those firms. So I look at a number of different cases, like the strike of Hu Yen in China, Arvind, which is a shoe producer, like one in, you know, the 5 pairs of shoes in this room that we're wearing. I mean, I'm not wearing any shoes, but will be produced in a Hu Yen facility, right? That's huge. That's very different from like 20, 30 years ago when you had tens of thousands of producers around the world. So that means that Nike or Adidas or whatever have a changing relationship with their suppliers, where the suppliers have greater disruptive power. And so I looked at, for example, one of the strikes I looked at was at the Hu Yen facility in 2014. It was the largest private sector strike of an employer in Chinese history. And since then as well. But it's, you had 50,000 workers go on strike in Guangzhou, and they were able to extract huge numbers of kind of, of concessions, basically, but they didn't win their demands. But also, most importantly, Nike and Adidas couldn't outsource. They did it short term, but they went back to them. They didn't cut and run. So it's an important indication of the kind of power that these firms have and the kinds of powers suppliers, workers in those firms have, right? Historically, if you make we have this kind of, the ultra left sometimes will be like, you can demand the universe. It's like, no, you really can't, unfortunately. That would be great if you could. Or like the neoclassical economists who are like, workers get what they deserve because we live in an equilibrium where supply and demand like shapes the entire world. It's not that either. It's that workers get what they demand based on what's available, right? So if there's very little available at these kind of very marginal suppliers who are never able to escape the orbit of that marginality due to the monopsonistic relationship, workers can't make demands because if they make demands, these huge brands just cut and run, right? Whereas if you have a firm like Yuyan or Arvind that I looked at in India or other firms, it means that workers can make greater demands, and it's not an automatic relationship, but that's basically the demand. Like you have greater, if the supplier has greater disruptive power, workers have greater disruptive power, and also if those firms are investing more at the point of production in labor saving technology, for example, because it's much harder to replace them. So let's say you're a capitalist in Cambodia or India or Korea or whatever, that 20 years ago, it might have taken £1 million to open up a firm, an export-oriented garment factory. Let's say an auto factory is 100 million, aeronautics factory is like 1 billion. What that means is to replace that aeronautics factory becomes near impossible. So workers there have much more power. Whereas if you're like in the garment factory, 20 years ago it's 1 million, now it's 3 million. It means that monopsonistic relationship is less, which means they can't replace them as easily because you don't have capitalists as many capitalists who are willing or able to open up a factory. Anyways, that is the basic thesis of the book, and that's also like backed up with a host of examples and in-depth stuff. And so what it means is that it's I'm doing that thing where I'm like, it's so exciting, the world's changing. But yeah, it is actually the case that capitalism a wily one. But what it looks like is that traditional model of what we understand to be a sweatshop is changing. It might be kind of a twilight of the sweatshop age, but it also might just be a new phase of neoliberalism.
Well, it's a great book. I've been reading it and very much enjoying it.
Not exactly a question, but I think the biggest lesson that I draw from today's conversation is that sometimes you gotta go out and camp on a road and not come home.
Yeah, exactly.
The second lesson was that the Indian bourgeoisie are the dumbest in the world. I don't know if I can accept that right now, but I'll keep it in mind.
There is stiff competition.
Yeah. I think the case is that when the bourgeoisie are like in stark power for so long, they get lazy and they start using their brain power or train to become them when they feel challenged. And it seems like India hasn't been challenged for so long, and maybe this farmer strike might kick some sense into them, or even better, kick them out.
Maybe.
Fingers crossed.
All right, well, seems like that is a very good note to end on. All right, thanks everyone for listening. Thank you, Ashok Kumar, for joining us and taking the time out. I know you're a busy man. Everyone listening, buy Ashok's new book, Monopsony Capitalism. It is a very interesting read. Thank you, Ashok, for joining us today on Red Star Over Asia. If you enjoyed this discussion and you want to hear more, subscribe on Spotify or Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next episode, we're going to have another special guest on to talk about Myanmar and the coup and the mass movement and resistance against that coup. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, comrades, for listening, and we'll sign off here.